Good afternoon. I'm doing this recording in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I do wish I could be with you in Oxford to do in person the Paget Toynbee lecture. It's with much regret that I have decided to do it from afar, though I must say it is exciting to think of my words being said now and perhaps heard a week from today in Oxford. I want to thank the friends who have invited me to give this lecture and promise to them and to myself that I will be back in Oxford as soon as I can, as soon as it is possible, in Oxford, where I have many friends and many places that I always return to with great pleasure. My lecture this afternoon is an English version of an introduction to a recent book of mine published in Italy by Longo entitled Dante Popolare. And the title of the lecture, as you well known, obviously, is Dante Culture and the People. What did Dante Alighieri's culture really consist of? First off, it could not consist entirely, or even mostly, of literature, history, philosophy, theology, and the natural sciences. Or at least, it could not consist entirely of the learning which goes under those generic titles and which, 7 centuries later, we still investigate in our attempts to draw a not wholly imaginary intellectual portrait of the poet of the comedy. All of us, especially those who grew up in pre-industrial, pre-digital environments, offering limited schooling, absorb a vast quantity of notions by osmosis from our family and immediate social circles. This happens before and while learning to read and write, and continues through life, including the periods we spend studying the classics and the Bible. Our cultural formation is the result of both formal education and informal experiences, the latter only minimally associated with written sources. Now, it seems to me entirely reasonable to assume that in this day, or rather in his day, Dante had a similar experience. However, while we know little about his likely formal schooling, we know next to nothing about the actual circumstances in which his intellectual formation took place. For example, we know nothing about his role as husband of Gemma Donati and father of 3, possibly 4 children. To what extent did such real-life experiences help to shape Dante's character, his personality, his view of the world? How did his actual life determine that uniquely individual lens through which he acquired his learning? What do we know about the physical and social environment in which he grew up, or in which later on he pursued his brief but notable career in politics? So, in a nutshell, how can we discuss Dante's culture while knowing nothing, absolutely nothing, about what he learned from unwritten sources, or from written but very humble sources that may not have survived? Undoubtedly, Dante had a clear, fruitful, and profound notion of knowledge, or rather what he called philosophia, philosophy, the most beautiful and most honest daughter of the emperor of the universe, sister and most favorite daughter of the Lord, as he calls it in the Convivio, encapsulating all his world sciences. As he confesses in his Convivio, Dante is entirely enraptured by her. But it is love for the highest kind of learning, a love of intellectual nature, un amoroso uso di sapienza, remote from the wretched and base pleasures and vulgar habits of the masses. This learning has little to do with our broad notion of culture, and nothing whatsoever with popular culture. Of course, it is unlikely that Dante shared our assumptions about culture, individual or collective. The former, to put it in the most basic terms, would be the aggregate of knowledge and mental skills acquired by individuals through study, schooling, and experience of their environment. Collective culture, a more recent notion, is the complex of the social, economic, and political institutions, as well as the artistic, spiritual, and religious expressions prevailing in a particular society at a given moment in time. We cannot simply apply these conceptions of culture to Dante and his age without some caveats. But that should not discourage, let alone prevent, our inquiries. Though Dante may not have shared our conception of culture, this is not to say he did not possess that accumulation of mental experiences which we might call his culture. Nor does it mean that his world did not have direct experiences of the phenomena which are the subject matter of cultural ethno-anthropology. There is no doubt in my mind that, especially in the Divine Comedy, Dante gives expression to a complex mix of human behavior, attitudes, thoughts, beliefs, concerns, fears, and hopes that are rooted in his life experiences. And for this reason, his readers recognized and still recognize themselves in his writing. More problematic, as I see it, is deciding whether, and if so, to what extent, Dante made a distinction in the culture of his day that we make in ours between high and low events, artifacts, subjects, styles, and levels of life. Did he distinguish the high and refined from the low and popular? Judging from the comedy, the distinction does exist, but it has to do with moral values more than with culture and aesthetics. So, we may say that the Dante of the comedy addresses all of his writing to all of his readers and listeners without anachronistic distinctions about cultural levels. If we wish to portray Dante in terms of the elements of his culture which he shared with ordinary people, the first hurdle is the very notion of popular culture, or more simply, the notion of popular, an extremely slippery phenomenon and category, especially in the literary historical context of an era as remote from us as the 13th and 14th centuries. When we try to define its historical boundaries, we soon find that if we draw the net too tight, we catch little or nothing. And if we open it too wide, we catch almost everything. In both cases, the notion proves to be of little use as a tool for analyzing and classifying literary and cultural phenomena. Nowadays, popular describes anything, especially for mass consumption, that is characterized by socially and aesthetically low content. But how can we apply such concepts to a mentality so remote and so different from our own in an era without printing, not to mention other mediums? It is even more difficult in the specific context of the second half of the 13th century, a time of great ferment and change, when the very idea of the people was problematic, while the spoken word, the chief vehicle for communication and knowledge transmission among ordinary people, has left no trace. Let us consider for a moment the notion of popolo, people. In Florence, in the second half of the 13th century, the word had a specific meaning, hard for us to pin down, denoting, broadly speaking, the middle class, old and new, what would later be called the bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie. It excluded, on the one hand, the elite, mostly but not entirely aristocratic, and on the other, manual workers or the popolo minuto, or lower classes, the producers of material goods. Naturally, such divisions were highly unstable, subject to continuous adjustments and modifications as a consequence of reciprocal pressures and impulses, some of them violent. However, even in this special sense, the popolo of Florence in 1300 is not what we today call the people. It is not the workers against the bosses or the proletariat against the ruling class, nor is it the poor against the rich or the ignorant against the educated. Here in Florence in 1300, popolo means the members of the guilds, notaries, merchants, artisans, and other professionals, as opposed to the noble families that were not allowed into the guilds. Dante, however, uses the word, this word, or rather the word in this technical sense, only in one instance in his entire opus, in Paradiso 16, lines 13132, to indicate the people's side in the struggle against the nobility. Avvegna che col popolo si rauni oggi colui che la fascia col fregio. As Davide Cappi puts it, in Dante's writings, references to the people, and for that matter, almost all references to the social reality of Florence are ambiguous. To put it briefly, they are allusions of which we can never offer incontrovertible interpretations, but merely suggest possible readings. As a general rule, Dante uses the word popolo, populus in Latin, to denote the population or the inhabitants of a given city, region, or island, without any distinctions of profession, class, or social level. So, when he has Brunetto say, quello ingrato popolo maligno, that ungrateful, malign people, the word denotes the Florentines, just as it does when Cacciaguida says, Vidio glorioso e giusto il popol suo. I saw her people glorious and just. There is no sign anywhere in his works that Dante ever wrote or reflected in a systematic or sustained manner on the presence and role of what we call the popolo in the society of his times. And on the few occasions that he does mention them, he makes it plain that he takes a dim view of the popular masses, regarding them as more or less on the same level as animals, incapable of civilized life. But more about this later. Here, an important qualification must be made. While Dante does not seem to have the notion of what we call popolo, he has an exceedingly strong belief in the idea of the city, in Latin civitas, civitas. The city is for him, in existential and political as well as theological terms, the fundamental form of human association, so long as it exists and functions within the framework of the universal order assured by the empire. Within the plurality of the city, he recognizes the existence of human forces, driven for him mainly by greed, that unleash factionalism and violence. But he classifies them in moral rather than social terms. The ideal city for Dante seems to be a static organization that does not develop, grow, or change in time, either demographically or economically, except to its own peril. That's why he deplores, through his ancestor Cacciaguida, the changes that had occurred in Florence in the previous 150 years or so, especially the huge demographic growth that in 1 century had increased Florence fivefold. As Cacciaguida memorably puts it, sempre la confusione delle persone principio fu del mal della cittade. The mixture of peoples has always been the beginning of the city's ills. A statement, I'm sorry to say, that was taken over at a certain point by La difesa della razza in fascist Italy. Thus, whatever the people may exactly be in social terms, for Dante, they are indeed part of the plurality that is the city. However, contented in the city's immobility, and this is a point that sharply divides Dante from us, they should not aim to change their condition. They should not aim to change their condition. A question comes inevitably to mind. What was Dante's social position in Florence? Now, little is known for certain. He may have descended from a family once of the lesser nobility, but in long-term decline. Or this claim to nobility may have been a family legend. The fact is that already by the time of Bellincione, Dante's grandfather, the Alighieri family seems firmly entrenched in a modest money-lending and real estate business. Dante's father, Alighiero II, whom Dante never mentions in his works, certainly was a small moneylender, a small businessman. In economic and social terms, in the second half of the 13th century, the Alighieri belonged to the broadly wealth-sympathizing middle class, the classe popolare. When, however, in 1289, Dante served at his own expense as a cavalryman at the Battle of Campaldino against Ghibellin Arezzo, and at the siege of the peasant castle of Caprona, he behaved as a nobleman was expected to, though, as Silvia Diacciati puts it, and I quote, "The milieu of Dante's daily life seems by and large to have been popolare, i.e. bourgeois and moderately well-to-do. The individuals with whom he had relationships, financial but also familial, acquired through his sister Tana's marriage, for example, were connected with the principal civic guilds, those of judges and notaries, the various guilds of the cloth trades, the exchange, physicians and apothecaries. Many of them had held public office during periods of popular and, in a few cases, Ghibelline ascendancy. So Dante lived his daily life in middle-class circles, ambienti popolari, even though he may have boasted of socially more elevated relations and friends. This notwithstanding, we know, because Dante so tells us candidly and often, that he did not have a soft spot for the mercantile class, specifically the new rich, the gente nuova with their sudden profits, or for the ordinary people in general. Beyond that, and providing we stick close to his writings, we may speculate what Dante thought about the various social pressures within the society of his day and whether he identified with some, assuming that he did in fact identify with any. But there is little we can assert with any certainty. In his Convivio, he refers to those commoners, popolari persone, he calls them, who, busy throughout their lives with a trade, have not developed the light of discernment, la luce discretiva. In this context, he is referring to all those people who are so deeply immersed in their professions that they do not have the spare mental capacity or the time to commit to self-improvement. They are and will remain throughout their lives pecore, sheep. Being without reason and discernment, they will allow themselves to be led by mentitori, deceivers, even to the extent of acting against their own interests. These blind people are probably to be identified with the middle class referred to shortly before, but seeing that, as Dante puts it, they are almost infinite, it would be fair to assume that they also include small artisans and workers. Dante also uses the word vulgo with disparaging connotations and in reference to the least educated people. It is a cultural, intellectual category, not a sociological one, referring to that mass of people who, while not necessarily at the lowest rungs of the class ladder, do not have a natural interest in learning. We cannot say whether this mass includes the proletariat, because Dante does not specifically identify it. We may say, however, that Dante does not hold the alternative, more ideological, socio-economic conception of the people as the body of the least prosperous and least cultivated citizens of a given city, region, or nation. That is, the subordinate classes made up of small shopkeepers, artisans, workers, and proletarians. The lower orders, whom Alessandro Manzoni called the umili. What we may state with some assurance is that Dante had no regard or respect for paid work of any kind. No regard or respect for paid work of any kind. And on the rare occasions when he does allude to manual work, he does so with undisguised disdain, judging it to be downright subhuman. O stoltissime e vilissime bestiuole, che a guisa d'uomo voi pascete, che presumete contra nostra fede parlare e volete sapere, filando e zappando, ciò che Dio con tanta prudenza ha ordinato. O most foolish and vile beasts, he writes, who disguised as men graze and presume to speak against our faith, and while spinning and hoeing desire to know what God with so much wisdom has ordained. Here, spinning and hoeing clearly represent the humblest occupations of respectively women and men, and by extension, those individuals with the lowest intellectual capacities. Giovanni Villani writes, because of his culture, lo suo saver, this Dante was rather haughty, unapproachable and disdainful, and like an awkward philosopher, he wasn't very good at interacting with the illiterate, that is, I laici. In the Convivio, Dante treats the common people, vulgo, guilty in this particular passage, of a mistaken and dangerous opinion, as on a par with animals, forever incapable of civilized life, and unworthy of the attentions of the wise. The condition of manual workers seemed to be beyond hope, and it was certainly not for them that Dante composed the Convivio. And here he writes, coloro di rizzare intendo, nei quali alcuno lumetto di ragione per buona loro natura vive ancora, che degli altri tanto è da curare quanto di bruti animali, però che non minore maraviglia mi sembra riducere a ragione quelli in cui è ragione del tutto spenta, che riducere in vita colui che 4 dì è stato nel sepolcro. I mean to set straight those in whom, by virtue of their good nature, some spark of reason survives. The rest deserves no more attention than animals, because it seems to me that restoring to reason those in whom its spark is extinguished no less miraculous than bringing back to life someone who has been in the grave for 4 days. So, Dante, at least up to the Convivio, that is up to 1304, 1307, showed no sympathy for the people en masse, from great merchants to proletarians. But that did not stop him from abandoning the Convivio to write in the vernacular a popular poem. This is the extraordinary thing. Indeed, with the poem something changed, because in the 15 years or so it took him to write it, something changed in Dante himself. In the 3 central canti of Paradiso, Dante describes, as you well know, the encounter in the heaven of Mars with his ancestor Cacciaguida, grandfather of his own grandfather Bellincione, who was born around 1091 and died maybe in the Holy Land, maybe after being knighted by the emperor in 1147-48, during the Second Crusade. Cacciaguida talks about himself, about the Florence of his day, sobria e pudica, temperate and chaste, and by contrast, about the greedy, corrupt Florence of the present time. And finally, he reveals the grueling exile which awaits Dante. You have to remember that the comedy is set in 1300, and so Dante pretends that his exile has not started yet. But Cacciaguida tells him that he will be exiled. Cacciaguida says, tu proverai sì come sa di sale lo pane altrui, e come duro calle lo scendere e il salir per l'altrui scale. You will experience how the bread of others tastes of salt, and how tough it is to climb up and down other stairs. Dante's ancestor uses simple, concrete images to describe in a highly compressed way the painful and humiliating experience of exile. The start of the second line and the end of the third, lo pane altrui, l'altrui scale, form a chiasmus which fuses in a most memorable fashion, thanks to the heavy assonance of pane and scale, the 2 primary concerns of the exiled person, food and shelter, pane e casa. Even for these basic necessities of life, Cacciaguida tells Dante, you will depend on the charity of others. Dante the poet could hardly express himself in a manner more plain and direct, more universal, and if we might as well say it, more popular. Food and shelter, modest but essential, are the first necessities of which the exile of any age is deprived. Now, for centuries, the expression come sa di sale, literally how it tastes of salt. This expression has been broadly understood in the sense of how bitter exile is. But for me, and for others as well, it has a more precise and concrete meaning. The phrase means quite literally what it says, that is, how salty, and therefore unpleasant, pungent, and bitter is the taste of other people's bread. That is, bread not baked in Florence. This explanation makes sense if we recall that from the 13th century onwards, in Florence and other parts of Tuscany, bread was made without salt, as indeed it still is today. Thus, every time the exile tastes bread made elsewhere, its saltiness is a reminder that he is eating il pane altrui, the bread of others. It is undoubtedly a genuine experience, emblematic of the distress and humiliation of the exile, forced to fight for everything, even a crust of bread, and obliged every day to swallow his pride if he is to survive. And it is the condition that Dante had already endured for 16, maybe 18 years, when in 1318, 1320, he was writing the middle canti of Paradiso. He had already written bitterly about exile in the Convivio. And I must read this passage to you, famous but beautiful and unforgettable. Poi che fu piacere delle cittadine della bellissima e famosissima figlia di Roma, Fiorenza, di gettarmi fuori del suo dolce seno, nel quale nato e nutrito fui infino al colmo della vita mia, e nel quale, con buona pace di quella, desidero con tutto lo core di riposare l'animo stancato e terminare lo tempo che m'è dato. Per le parti quasi tutte alle quali questa lingua si stende, peregrino, quasi mendicando sono andato, mostrando contra mia voglia la piaga della fortuna, che suole ingiustamente al piagato molte volte essere imputata. Veramente, io sono stato legno, senza vela e senza governo, portato a diversi porti e foci, e liti dal vento secco che vapora la dolorosa povertate. E sono apparito agli occhi a molti che forse che per alcuna fama in altra forma m'avevano immaginato, nel conspetto dei quali non solamente mia persona invidio, ma di minor pregio si fece ogni opera, sì già fatta, come quella che fosse a fare. Since when it pleased the citizens of Florence, Rome's most beautiful and celebrated daughter, to expel me from her soft bosom, in which I was born and nourished until the prime of life, and in which with her kind acquiescence I desire with all my heart to rest my weary spirit and live out the days allotted to me. I have traveled to almost every place where our language is spoken, like a stranger, practically a beggar, displaying against my will those sores inflicted by fortune, which so many unfairly blame on the sufferer. In truth, I have been a ship without sail and without tiller, bored to different ports, river mouths, and beaches by the dry winds of painful poverty. And I have appeared before many who, perhaps because of some fame of mine, expected me to be different. In their eyes, not only was I less of a person, but it cheapened all my writings too, those already finished and those still to come. Sad words, but relatively restrained. Most likely written in late 1304 or 1305, when Dantes' exile was recent and he still hoped perhaps to return to Florence. Moderate words, calculated to flatter key Florentines, who might apply themselves to have his decree of exile reversed. The images of Florence, beauteous and a famous mother who chases the poet away from her sweet bosom, of Dante the wanderer, the mendicant, and of the ship without sail or helm on the sea of life. These images are dignified and elevated, if not quite original. The last lightly embellished by the classicizing synedoche of timber for ship. The difference between the illustrious vernacular of the Convivio and Cacciaguida's dry Florentine leaps out at us. The realism of the poem, concrete and concise, has replaced the metaphorical eloquence of the treatise. Dante seems to have developed a new sensitivity about the basic necessity of life, food and shelter, and given his circumstances, it would be strange if he had not done so. From 1305-06 onwards, he had to wander from city to city, from castle to castle, accompanied at least after 1315, but possibly even earlier, by his two male children, Jacopo and Pietro, begging for food and lodging, for himself and for all of them, from rulers, towns and cities ranging from the Lunigiana to the Casentino, from Romagna to the Veneto, from Bologna to Lucca, Verona and Ravenna, to name a selection of places where he found shelter. Dante is not one of those political refugees who eventually accept their condition and make a new life elsewhere, far from their homeland. He accepts, or says he accepts, his exile, but everywhere and at all times he remains a stranger, an alien, bound to the idea of his adored and detested Florence. And it is with that name in his mind and his heart that, starting in 1307, 1308, he composed, not by chance, in the Florentine vernacular, the Inferno and Purgatorio, and then, years later, the Paradiso. Consider the first lines of Canto 25 of Paradiso, probably composed around 1320. Se mai continga che il poema sacro al quale ha posto mano e cielo e terra, sì che m'ha fatto per molti anni macro, vinca la crudeltà che fuor mi serra del bello vile ov'io dormì agnello nimico ai lupi che gli danno guerra. Con altra voce omai, con altro vello ritornerò poeta e in sul fonte del mio battesimo prenderò il cappello. If it ever happens that the sacred poem to which heaven and earth set their hand, and which over so many years has made me lean, should overcome the cruelty which locks me out of that sweet fold where I slept as a lamb, enemy of the wolves which make war on it. With another voice then, and another fleece shall I return a poet, and at the fount of my baptism take the laurel crown. Or consider the exclamation by the pilgrim in the Imperium, dumbfounded before the white rose. Io che al divino dall'umano, all'eterno dal tempo era venuto di Fiorenza in popol giusto e sano. I who was come to the divine from the human, to the eternal from time, and from Florence to a people just and sane. The myth of Florence is intact right to the end, But the Dante who placed so much emphasis on the salted bread he had to beg for in alien places, and the stairs he had to climb and descend to guarantee a roof over his head, is a different Dante from the aristocratic intellectual of Convivio, who despises the popolare persone because, busy as they are earning their crust, they have no time and ease to think about improving themselves. This new Dante, who before his years of exile had always lived on a private income, however modest, and had never had to work to support himself and his family, now, after nearly 20 years of exile, writes in a different fashion that reveals a new sensitivity to human sufferings, a sensitivity which somehow brings him closer to ordinary people, and which the people so identify with that the central canti of Paradiso are among the handful of the most popular canti in the whole poem. Thus, as we move from the Convivio to the comedy, Dante's attitude towards the people seems to change quite substantially, becoming deeper, more empathetic, and more genuine. The historiographical problem is that, while for Dante the people remains a rather vague category which probably includes the emergent bourgeoisie, for us, by contrast, the people is a much narrower social class, one uniquely associated with the culture already in existence, but only from the 19th century recognized as popular culture. These points have two important corollaries. First, the popular dimension of the comedy does not coincide with the culture of what we today call the people, il popolo. Instead, it corresponds to a broader and more mixed social and cultural reality in which oral and figurative culture are present alongside some basic elements of written culture. Second, when Dante decides to abandon the treatise, that is the Convivio, and devote himself to the poem, that is the comedy, and what is more, to compose the poem in the vernacular, he certainly does not do so for the benefit of any particular social class, but of everyone who speaks, reads, or at least understands the Florentine dialect. In other words, Dante casts a much wider net than that hinted at in the Convivio, and also wider than what, since the 19th century, is generally labeled popular culture and traditions. The culture Dante is addressing with the comedy is the culture of the late 13th century preachers, such as the Franciscan Servasanto da Faenza, who died towards the end of the century, and the Dominicans Remigio de Girolami and Giordano da Pisa. Their sermons, with the sacred and secular sources they depend on, provide a crucial perspective on the culture of the people Dante engaged with through his poem. Other works which tell us something about Dante's informal or popular culture, works traditionally regarded as minor, if not altogether negligible, include accounts of visions and supernatural journeys, glosses on biblical texts, florilegia, anthologies, books of maxims and handbooks for confessors, miscellaneous collections, bestiaries and lapidaries, and religious songs. Over the past 30 or 40 years, much of this material has been the subject of editions, translations, and scholarship, which has made it more easily accessible. Minor it may well be, but this literature reflects the culture of its times, the knowledge in circulation and which individuals absorbed in public places, streets, schools, and churches. On the basis of these texts, there is emerging the belief that Dante's knowledge was the fruit of more checkered and haphazard cultural experiences than has generally been assumed. This minor literature is also extremely valuable because it gives us a not arbitrary idea of the kind of culture which Dante and his public shared. The culture, by definition, interdiscursive, which Dante tuned into when he was composing his comedy. So when Giovanni del Virgilio, professor of Latin in Bologna, who really ought to have known better, criticizes Dante as the author of a Carmine Laico, that is, popular poetry, and of literature for gens idiota, that is, unlettered folks, he does so on the basis of an elitist notion of poetry and learning, which excludes just about everyone except a handful of ecclesiastics and scholars, the high priests of letters, that is. In fact, Dante's audience includes everyone, or rather does not exclude anyone blessed with even a spark of intelligence, alcuno lumetto di ragione, a class which he now extends well beyond the boundaries once indicated in the Convivio. Perhaps the most revealing sign of the popular nature of the comedy comes from another, much more authoritative voice, that of Francesco Petrarca. Petrarch grew up in the shadow of the colossal success of Dante's poem. But he refused to recognize it or even speak publicly about it, at least until 1359. Then, in 1359, in reply to requests from Boccaccio and others, he wrote and, as we know, circulated a letter in which he defended himself from those who blamed his coldness towards the Divine Comedy on jealousy, and in turn blamed his accusers of being jealous of him. However, the letter was so ambiguous that instead of laying the controversy to rest, it stoked the embers into a blaze which has never completely subsided, and even today, readers are more divided than ever about what Petrarch really meant. In his letter, Petrarch announced at the outset that he considered the poet in question. Astonishingly, the letter never actually mentions Dantes Alighieri by name. He considered him popularis quidem quod ad stilum attinet, quod ad rem haudubie nobilis. Popular as far as style is concerned, though undoubtedly noble in what he writes. This is an extraordinary statement. The ambiguity is apparent right from the first sally, in which popularis is presented as the antithesis of nobilis. In the context of the whole letter, Petrarch's formulation is nothing less than a subterfuge intended to soften the appearance of a profoundly negative assessment of Dante's poetic merit. Indeed, it should also be pointed out that this fleeting allusion ad rem, that is to say, the subject matter of Dante's poem, is the only reference in the whole letter to what Dante's poem is about. And Petrarch, who is always extremely attentive to his reading, seems not to notice that what Dante writes about should concern him most closely, most personally. After all, was he not in those same years creating his canzoniere, i.e. the poetic register of what he called his vaneggiar, his vanities and ravings. It is difficult for us to accept that the great poet and humanist did not feel himself in some fashion touched, even implicated, if not personally indicted, by Dante's brilliant representation of human vices. But if he ever was, he certainly gave no sign of it. Clearly, he did not think much of the state of the souls after death, which inspired the writings of Dante's great poem. So, the gulf between Giovanni del Virgilio and Petrarch on one hand and Dante on the other could hardly be wider. But perhaps it is no wider than the gulf between the intellectual author of the Convivio and the poet-prophet of the comedy. Or if you will, between Dante before and Dante after the writing of the Divine Comedy. Perhaps Dante was too true to life for Petrarch, too close to the bone, as it were, a position which Dante, but not Petrarch, shared with ordinary people. To conclude, we know that the notion of popular culture, cultura popolare, belongs specifically to industrial and post-industrial societies. And therefore, it may seem anachronistic and inappropriate for illuminating Dante's world. However, given the overwhelmingly urban frame of reference of the comedy, I think that it may be a suitable and fruitful designation for what we might, broadly speaking, call the mentality from which Dante's masterpiece, with its particular worldview, emerged and in which it found its expression, not by accident, in the language of the people of Florence. Thank you.